Hey class, welcome to our first lecture of the semester, going over Chapter 1, Introduction to Criminal Behavior. Um, I'm also going to post all of these PowerPoint presentations at the bottom of your the course so that you'll have access to them as we move through the semester so that you can have them as notes and go back and reference them. All right. So, of course, the first important thing to discuss when we're talking about criminal psychopathology is what actually is a crime and how is it defined. Um, so, crime is something that goes against a certain code or a law that's been in place that's in violation. Um, of course, it's hard to have an all-encompassing explanation or definition for crime because when you think about different states, different countries, different cultures, all of these things come into play. And so it would be really hard to just have an absolutely concrete definition. For our purposes, though, we'll be really looking at the psychology behind people who are breaking laws, and specifically breaking pretty big, important laws, or doing sort of major crimes. Theories of crime. Um, there's lots of different ideas about crime. The first theory that the book discusses in Chapter 1 is the just world hypothesis. The just world hypothesis is really when people believe that the world itself is just and fair. And so if something happens to somebody, if they're a victim of a crime, it means that somehow they kind of set themselves up for that or didn't protect themselves enough, as they should. So this is not the just world. Really believe that things do not happen to people without a reason. So, like if somebody broke into your house, for example, somebody who followed this just world belief system would think that that had to do with you not protecting your home well enough. Also coming into play in the just world theory is this idea of, people kind of getting what they deserve. So as you can imagine, this theory can often go against a lot of what we like to think about as far as not victim blaming people and that sort of thing. This would be a little bit of the opposite of that mentality. So when we're talking about theories of crime, and we're talking about the scientific theory, which hopefully you've all covered in some of your earlier coursework. When we're specifically talking about crime theory, we're trying to identify the causes or precursors of criminal behavior. And of course, that would be because the hope is if we understand it better and we understand what leads up to it, then we will be able to reduce crime or at least control it in a better way. So again, we're just going to kind of run through some theories. Classical theory emphasizes free will as a core concept. This comes into play when we're talking about criminal behavior because, again, it's kind of this idea that people have their own free agency and decisions to make, and how they act on their own free will and freedom of choice is on them. Then next we have the deterrence theory. The deterrence theory is a little bit more of like a modern version of classical theory. And what this means is that if there's a reason for people to not do the crime, if the punishment or consequences are high enough and swift enough, that will deter people from doing the crime. So one example of this would be surveillance cameras on public streets would be an argument to say that because they know that they're on camera and they know that if they're on camera doing a crime, therefore they will be caught doing that crime, that will deter them from doing that. So again, going back to how it relates to classical theory, using your own free will and agency to decide not to do the crime based on the consequences. Positivist theory, this really kind of looks more into the depths of maybe nurture more than nature. So instead of just saying everybody has their own free will and can therefore make decisions based on that free will and free agency, we need to actually go back and look at prior experiences or influences, especially in childhood, to see what's going on for somebody and why they perhaps decided to follow that criminal path or have those behaviors. So lack of education, lack of opportunity, negative early life experiences. Of course, we know absolutely that early childhood trauma can negatively impact a person's psychological health forever. So, looking at things like that as opposed to just saying, well, we all have the same decision-making process, so we should all be able to follow the laws and do the same things. When we start thinking about adverse childhood experiences and how that influences how somebody's brain develops, it might be a little more complex than just the free will and the classical theory of behavior. There's a conformity perspective, shifting now into talking more about theoretical perspectives on human nature. So conformity perspective is the theory that humans are actually good, and that we try to do the right thing, and that we're not out there trying to be bad or make negative decisions. One prominent sociological explanation for crime based on Robert Merton's theory that crime and delinquency occur when there is a perceived discrepancy between the materialistic values and goals cherished and held in high esteem by a society and the availability of the legitimate means for reaching these goals. So when you think again, kind of tying back into that idea of adverse childhood experiences or children growing up in abject poverty, and our society holding materialistic value very high, in high esteem, meaning that that's how we're really gauging people's success. So in our culture, people with money are celebrities, and people pay so much attention and sort of build that up as the definition of success. So when there's a real strain, then that can lead to people doing criminal actions, right, to achieve those things, if the availability of achieving those things in a law-abiding fashion is maybe not available or not as easily accessed. The reason that it's called the strain theory, is because what happens when you have the esteem of all of this, monetary value or whatever, being so hard to achieve, this creates a big strain between the goals of wealth and power and the means for reaching them. And when this groups and individuals experience this high level of strain, they are forced to decide whether they're going to violate the social norms and laws to attain some of that sought after wealth or power, or give up on the idea that they might ever have it. And so that can lead to people deciding to engage in criminal behavior to try to reach those perceived goals of success. The nonconformist perspective is sort of the opposite, thinking more of humans as being undisciplined and needing to be held in check with social control. This is more along the lines of thinking that without strict laws and strict order, that people would be engaging in more criminal behavior. Seeing humans as fundamentally unruly, needing to be held in check. And this also ties into social control theory, which was a theory proposed by Travis Hirschi that contends that crime and delinquency occur when an individual's ties to the conventional order or normative standards are weak or largely non-existent. So, again, kind of going back to this idea that without a connection to the social norms, then people are going to act delinquent and have criminal behavior. The learning perspective goes back to thinking that humans are really born neither as nonconformist or conformist, but instead are born pretty neutral and subject to developmental changes throughout the life course. So this means that, again, going back to the idea that people are really products of their environment, and depending on how their life unfolds, this is how they are going to have perceptions about criminal behavior and what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. When you think about a child growing up in a home where crime and substance use are pretty normalized, that person is going to have a much higher risk of falling into those same behaviors as an adult, because as a child, that was, they learned that was acceptable, or that was how people lived. Social learning theory is closely tied to that, meaning that you're learning from watching other people. Again, going back to my example of what children are experiencing and normalizing for themselves is going to greatly impact their behavior later in life. And then differential association theory is a theory that was formulated by Sutherland, and this is a theory of crime that states that criminal behavior is primarily due to obtaining values or messages from others, including but not limited to those who engage in crime. The critical factors include with whom a person associates, how early, for how long, how frequently, and how personally meaningful the associations are. So those associations will be, or the impact on behavior will be much stronger if the association is more long-term or is more meaningful and impactful to somebody. So again, thinking of a child growing up in a home like that and looking up to their parents and seeing how they behave, and then because the parental connection is so strong, that really becomes how the child perceives what is right and wrong. And normal, I guess, also normalizing, right? Sociological criminology examines relationships of demographic and group variables to crime and underlying social conditions. So, again, just looking at how all of the sociological impacts, the subcultural norms and beliefs about crime, demographics, right? So where people are living and how they are living, and how that plays into their predilection towards criminal behavior. So psychological criminology is the science of the behavior and mental processes of the person who commits crime, which is what we're really going to be looking at throughout this course. Different approaches here. So psychological criminology approaches include the cognitive approach, neurological or biological approach, the developmental approach, and the trait approach. So the cognitive approach refers to, when you think about cognitive, you think about cognition. So when we're talking about criminal offenders, cognitions are often distorted for these people. The example in the book is that, for people who believe that the only way that children are going to behave is with, severe physical consequences for their behavior. Or also the idea that victims aren't actually being hurt by the perpetrator of the crime. So all of these distorted cognitions. So distorted cognition meaning, of course, not true, a false belief. Biological or neurological approach. So as we are increasingly able to do, scans and tests and all of that thing, all of those kinds of things, criminologists are really recognizing that there are significant links between biology and human behavior. So, for instance, a traumatic brain injury, or as referred to as a TBI, especially a serious TBI, can really change someone's behavior and can make them more prone to violent outbursts, less able to manage their emotions well, and can really shift just who that person is as far as personality. So that would be one example of a biological shift that causes more criminal behavior. A developmental approach examines the changes and influences across a person's lifetime that contribute to the formation of antisocial and criminal behavior, or, on the other side of that protect individuals with many risk factors in their life. So, kind of looking at the span of development there and noting that for somebody who grows up in some of those adverse situations that I was just discussing, and has high risk factors, there are some things that can come into play that can really shift the trajectory of that person's life. One of the strongest factors is having a caring adult for a child who has significant risk factors, having a secure attachment to a caring adult mentor, and also learning good social skills are really, really beneficial protective factors. And then there's the trait approach. So a trait is a relatively stable and enduring tendency to behave in a particular way across time and place. Traits are believed by some psychologists to be the building blocks of personality. In recent years, researchers have really given attention to some traits. These are collectively termed callous, unemotional traits that are often associated with psychopaths, individuals to be discussed later on in our book. These callous, unemotional traits are characterized by a lack of empathy and concern for the welfare of others, and they often lead to a persistent and aggressive pattern of antisocial personality. Okay, just going to go back to this other slide. I'm not quite sure. Oh, I can't. Okay, sorry guys. So, I don't know what happened to that other slide, but it won't let me go back and redo it. So, just want to talk to you about psychiatric criminology. So psychiatric criminology is really kind of examining the internal forces and unconscious drives that can lead criminal behavior. Traditionally followed the Freudian psychoanalytical or psychodynamic tradition. Again, hopefully all of you have had some time to study Freud and psychoanalysis in previous psychology courses. There are other psychoanalysts who follow Alfred Adler and Carl Jung, who are two who broke away from Freud and really developed different theories about the human condition. contemporary psychiatrists, so psychiatrists who are currently interested in the study of criminal behavior, are actually less likely to be psychoanalytical in orientation. They are heavily influenced by the medical model of mental illness and subscribe to diagnostic categories that are outlined in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders. Important to note here as we're talking about this that some diagnoses are associated with specific types of crime, but it's really important to not presume that people with mental illness are more likely to commit crime than people without mental illness. I think that the belief that people with a mental illness are more dangerous and more likely to be violent is something that just really contributes to the fear around mental illness and can really play into that stigma. So I just want to make that real clear that there's not a direct correlation there. And in fact, less than 10% of the crime committed by individuals with mental disorders was a product of their mental illness. Okay, so when we're talking about measuring crime, there are 3 ways of measuring crime. The official police reports. These are broken down into these 2 different systems. The Uniform Crime Reports, which the UCR, and this has been compiled since 1930 and is the most cited source of U.S. crime statistics. The UCR really breaks crimes down into 8 specific categories. These are listed on page 15 of your textbook. So violent and property offenses is how they are broken down into 2 sections. Violent crime is comprised of 4 offenses: murder, and non-negligent manslaughter, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault. Property crimes are burglary, larceny, theft, motor vehicle theft, and arson. The primary object of the offender in property crime is the taking or destruction of money or property. And of course, in the violent crime, that is different because the main victim is a human and is not just property. In order to appear in the UCR as one of the 8 crimes, they must meet the following requirements: be experienced by the victim or observed by someone else, be defined as a crime by the victim or the observer, in some way become known to a law enforcement agency as a crime, be defined by that law enforcement agency as a crime, be accurately recorded by the law enforcement agency, be reported to the FBI Compilation Center. So it's really important to remember that data in the UCR is crime rate data, only these 8 categories, okay? The National Incident-Based Reporting System has sort of become maybe the primary reporting system. Starting in the late 1970s, law enforcement community really called for the expanded use of the UCR and also more detailed information on a crime than the summary statistics offered in the UCR. So in response, the NIBRS was initiated, the National Incident-Based Reporting System. It reports details on each single crime incident as well as on separate offenses within the same incident, including information on victims, known offenders, relationships between victims and offenders, arrestees, and property involved in crimes. So that's different than the UCR because the UCR utilizes a hierarchy rule, which means that it only reports the most violent or the worst crime, even if multiple things were committed at the same time. So if somebody broke into a house and stole $100 and assaulted somebody, the only thing reported would be the assault. So that's part of the reason for the call from law enforcement to shift to this national incident-based reporting system. Then there are also self-report studies. Self-report studies would be where researchers just go in and have people fill out surveys, or have, go in and question people. People who are studying criminal psychopathology and researching criminal behavior often will go into incarceration facilities and do self-report studies on the inmates there to find out more about whatever aspect of their criminal behavior they are researching. Self-report studies are also really used when we're thinking about high school students and trying to understand what's happening for them, and trying to sort of help predict maybe some risk factors that they might face. And then victimization studies are also very important. The National Crime Victimization Survey is a government-sponsored survey of victims of crime, and is intended to collect data from the victim's perspective on crimes both reported and not reported to police, which is really important when we think about how many crimes go unreported to law enforcement. That's where the power of victimization studies can really come into play, because that way there is data being collected about crimes that might not have been reported to law enforcement. Of course, the things that go most unreported are crimes of a sexual nature. Interestingly enough, there has been an increase in reports of sexual assault and rape. And perhaps that is because there is more, support and sort of openness about the how common it is, and hopefully less shame being put on people and victims of those crimes. Okay, so then talking about uniform crime reports. Uniform crime reports are crimes known to police and arrests. 8 major crime, that's when I was going over the UCR, talking about the 8 major crime categories. And also, when we're talking about those crime categories, an important term to understand is the clearance rate. And the clearance rate refers to the proportion of reported crimes that have been solved through the arrest and turning over of at least one person for prosecution. Crimes may also be cleared through exceptional means, such as the death of the person about to be arrested. That would still equal that crime has been cleared. So it's not just sitting there unsolved. So the UCR includes a report of the clearance rate of all of those 8 major crime categories. Murder has the highest clearance rate, probably because, when we think of crime, that's probably the one that is the most damaging. And so I think there is a lot of attention on getting those crimes specifically cleared. So again, as I was talking about with the UCR, problems with the UCR would be this hierarchy rule that I went over in a couple slides ago. When there's a number of offenses that have been committed during a series, only the most serious is included. Of course, that really presents a problem, because it really skews the data about the other things that happened as well. If only one part of that is being reported, it's not really an accurate picture of the situation. There's also a dark figure, which refers to criminal offenses that are unknown or undetected. So again, going over this national incident-based reporting system, this provides an expanded and more detailed information than the UCR. There are Group A and Group B offenses in the National
incident-based reporting system. Group A includes 46 serious offense categories such as arson, assault, homicide, fraud, embezzlement, larceny, theft, and sex offenses. And then there's Group B, which includes 11 less serious offenses such as passing bad checks, driving under the influence of alcohol, engaging in disorderly conduct, drunkenness, nonviolent family offenses, liquor law violations. So, of course, a danger in labeling crimes as serious or not serious, because it seems that even in that list, just going over that briefly, there may be things that you think, well, that seems actually more serious, like driving under the influence of alcohol or something like that. So, an imperfect system, and also more information and more in-depth information than the previous system of the UCR. Self-report studies, as we kind of talked about, people are reporting on their own criminal or antisocial activities. Often this is done post-arrest, right? Post-sentencing, so that somebody's already incarcerated and not going to self-incriminate, because that would be a real deterrent from somebody being honest, obviously. But so this is people just reporting their own criminal or antisocial activities, and is done with interviews or questionnaire. And the drug use self-report surveys is what I was referring to, used a lot with adolescents to kind of gauge where our young people are at with, substance use and those potential dangers and downfalls. Victims, in a victimization survey, victims are providing information on the crimes committed against them. And important to note, there are some demographic differences in victimization rates. So one interesting thing about victimization would be to just sort of look at, again, going back to kind of the cultural impacts and the cultural differences that people are facing. Another thing that's important about a victimization survey is that, again, it's coming from the people who have been affected and impacted by whatever crime has happened, and giving them the opportunity to self-report that, I think, is important, and psychologically can shift somebody kind of more into a survivor mentality. Juvenile crime has really decreased since the 1990s. One term to understand when we're talking about juvenile delinquency, because when you think about a juvenile committing a crime, it's often a lot different than an adult, by which I mean that status offenses can be part of juvenile crime, but a status offense is something that if it was done by an adult, it wouldn't be illegal. So examples of that would be drinking alcohol. If you're under the age of 21, that's a status offense. Staying out past a curfew, running away from home, those types of things that you think about, again, as an adult, they would not be classified as a crime. Okay, and that is it for our first week. I hope you enjoyed the introduction to this book. I'm looking forward to working through this course with you and learning more about the psychopathology of criminal behavior. So I hope you have a great first week of classes. Don't forget to do your self-introduction discussion post and your discussion post for Chapter 1. All right, thanks, guys.